One of the most shocking executions of the Tudor period was when a young teenage girl during the reign of Queen Mary I was executed inside of the Tower of London. This young girl is often regarded as a queen and is remembered in history as the 9-Day Queen. Lady Jane Grey's demise inside the Tower of London is shocking, and she lost her head at the sharp end of the axe. She was allowed a private execution within the walls of the fortress, unlike her husband, who was dragged out onto Tower Hill, where his head was hacked from his shoulders. But after Jane's execution, she was then taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's chapel, and she was then buried inside of the same place where two of Henry VIII's wives and other countless important Tudor people were interred following their executions. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, efforts were made to exhume her, and there was a search for her. Lady Jane Grey became the Queen of England following the death of her cousin, Edward VI. The former Tudor king and son of Henry VIII had named Jane his successor to keep his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth off the throne. But Jane was taken to the Tower of London in the July of 1553 following her proclamation of Queen to await her coronation. But it was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, Mary, who would depose Jane, and she rose up inside of her nation, and she caused a significant rebellion to the point where the Privy Council switched their support to Mary. The effect of this was that Lady Jane Grey, the young teenage Protestant 9-Day Queen, was deposed, and the place where she was to await her coronation then became her prison. Her husband was also imprisoned, Guildford Dudley, and he was a man who dreamed of being made king by his wife. But Jane continued to refuse this during her short time on the throne. Jane was charged with high treason, and her trial took place at the Guildhall on the 13th of November 1553, and a special commission was to deal with her charges on behalf of Queen Mary I, who is of course also known as Bloody Mary. She was found guilty, and Jane's guilt was established as she assumed the title and the power of a monarch, and she signed some documents as Jane the Queen. But she was then sentenced to be burnt alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. But there was a belief after this that her life was to be spared by the new Queen Mary, and this was the perception that emerged after. But the major problem with Jane's fate was that she remained a threat to the Catholic Queen Mary's crown, and when a pro-Protestant rebellion emerged across England, it was clear that Mary would deal with her teenage cousin once and for all. She decided to sign the death warrant, and her execution was scheduled to go ahead on the 9th of February 1554, but it was postponed for 3 days, as Jane was given a chance to save her life if she converted to Catholicism. But Jane did not do this, and because of this she would be executed 3 days later. On the morning of her execution, she witnessed her husband Guildford leave the Tower for his execution, and she then also witnessed her husband's headless corpse returning back inside of the Tower for burial. And she screamed out when she saw this. It was shortly after this that Lady Jane Grey was summoned from her chambers for her execution. There was a scaffold inside of the tower where she was led towards, and when she reached the scaffold she claimed, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by the law I am condemned to the same. The fact indeed against the Queen's highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me. But touching the procurement and desire thereof by me or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God and the face of you, good Christian people, this day." This speech was remarkable, and it's considered that she was either 16 or just 17 when she was executed by an axeman who stood armed with his weapon of death. She admitted to her crimes, and she asked the executioner to dispatch her quickly, and she prepared herself. A blindfold was placed over her eyes, and then when she went to reach out for the block, she panicked, and a witness then helped her find her way to the block. And in one savage and quick strike from the axe, Lady Jane Grey was executed. Following this, her remains and head were then buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. This was close to the scaffold, and she was buried in a quick and hastily dug grave near to the altar. But let's remember that Jane was a Queen of England, and she did possess royal blood, meaning that it's most likely that she was buried close to the altar, which was said to have been reserved for prominent people. No memorial stone was placed on her grave, but during the Victorian time, work occurred inside of the chapel. There were renovations made because it was deemed that the chapel was not fit enough of a place for the burial of queens, and Jane was buried alongside Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, as well as others such as Margaret Pole, who possessed royal blood. But the work which was carried out included the floor of the chapel being lifted, as it was said to have been uneven, and because of this there was a significant amount of exhumation ordered of the burials near to the altar. The coffins of these people had decayed, and a huge number of burials were found inside of the chapel. But a remarkable number of burials were found. One of the most significant was the burial of Anne Boleyn, and Queen Victoria's physician was brought in to identify the remains of her, and he confirmed that this was Henry VIII's executed second wife, and she had lost her head in a dramatic fashion. And the remains of Anne were found just 2 feet down. The bones had piled in one spot, and the amount of investigation into Anne's remains was remarkable. However, there was more work to do inside of the chapel. It had been recorded that Lady Jane Grey and also Catherine Howard had been buried inside of the chapel nearby too. The search was on for Lady Jane's remains and body. However, it's claimed that a number of prominent Tudors were buried on the west side of the chancel inside of the chapel. Work was not specifically being carried out here, and it was here where the remains of Lady Jane Grey were found. What is surprising is that her remains were discovered as she was just a young girl, and one thing to consider is the age of her when she was executed, as her bones may have not fully hardened as she was a teenager. It's expected that her bones may not have stood the test of centuries, leading to the possibility that she was buried rather decently inside of a coffin. What is also interesting is that Jane was buried close to her husband, or next to him, and that Queen Mary I did bury her with significant dignity, allowing Jane to be buried next to Guildford, and also near to her father-in-law. This was something Henry VIII, Mary's father, would not have permitted. For example, his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, had her remains covered in quicklime to literally wipe her off the face of England. It is believed that Jane's body may have been placed inside of a new lead casket, and that this was then held inside of the Queen's house for some time inside the tower, whilst works were being carried out. Her body, if this was the case, would have been held in the same rooms as Anne Boleyn and other executed figures, before it was then reburied close to the high altar, with the lead casket having a plaque on that carried the name of Jane. There have been a consideration that the bones of Anne Boleyn could have actually been Jane, but this is debated also. Still, today Lady Jane Grey is buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and she was laid to rest a short distance away from where she lost her head. She was around 16 years old when she was brutally executed at the hands of Queen Mary I, or Bloody Mary, but it looked like she would be spared during her life, and it looked as if she would have escaped with mere imprisonment. Jane was someone who did not want to be queen, neither did she ask for it. The crown was thrust upon her in a religious solidification of the English Protestant Reformation, but her fate was horrific. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.